Welcome back to Metahumanism podcast, where we investigate the contemporary world at the intersection of metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism with the Ukrainian accent. Today's episode is the third in the series on political philosophy and philosophies of war. Last time I introduced the typology of violence, ranging from direct violence, such as physical, sexual, emotional, and verbal abuse, for example, through cultural violence and related forms such as symbolic or epistemic violence, and on to structural violence, which can include economic, algorithmic violence, state-sanctioned violence, and so on. Today I want to continue this examination by looking at how violence can also be thought, and has been in history thought, as not merely as a social aberration or only evil, but as a complex and often constitutive force of nature, life, and social order, as counterintuitive as that may sound on the surface. And this will lead up to looking more directly at the philosophies of war, starting with the next episode. Just again to reiterate what I said last time, it's not in any way, what I will be discussing is not in any way to just justify violence or praise or glorify it or romanticize it. It's just to present different perspectives on the phenomenon through history, and so these different perspectives have different insights that are valuable to consider. So before I begin, though, I want to, just like the last episode, I want to make it a little bit more personal and make a few remarks, introductory remarks. First of all, in the description to the previous episode on YouTube, I included some links to the online resources that may be useful to those who are actually facing a situation of, let's say, domestic violence and need or emotional abuse in their lives. This is no joke, and trauma is a very real thing. It lives in our bodies, and it affects everything in our lives. So this is a very serious topic. It's not just theoretical. So first and foremost, it is important to recognize and admit the situation when face the situation, the reality you're facing, whatever it is. Is that, there's a saying that not everything that you face can be changed, but you can't change anything until you face it. So I believe it was James Baldwin, if I'm not mistaken, who said that. So if you or someone you know, someone you care about, faces this situation, I would like to encourage you to be courageous and not fear to address it. It can be dangerous, it can be risky, but it's not about the absence of fear. It's about accepting whatever fear you may feel, and then acting in spite of it. That's what courage ultimately is. And you're never alone. Do not fear to reach out to somebody, even if it's a stranger. And I know it's also a risk involved in it, but if you need and you want to change the situation you're in, risk goes along with the territory. So I will include the same links again in the description to this video, to this episode, but I just want to mention there's a National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233, or SAFE. So 1-800-799-SAFE. or 7233, or you can text START to 88788 as another alternative. Again, START to 88788, or you can chat if you prefer at thehotline.org. One word, the hotline, no punctuation, .org. Again, do make sure you're safe first, and then reach out. So that's one consideration I wanted to mention. Secondly, I also want to share some details from my recent trip to South Dakota to illustrate what we will be discussing in a minute. So the nature of violence, meaning and violence as part of nature. So there are several things that come to mind from that trip, but a very poignant story, I think, that kind of encapsulates what we will be discussing today is that story of the bison and the population of bison in North America. So South Dakota is, I don't know if this is well known or not, but it's where the film Dances with Wolves or Dancing with Wolves with Kevin Costner was made. There's still several locations, film sets preserved, and you can visit in various locations across South Dakota. In addition, so the film is about that Civil War period and the culture, the native culture, the Sioux Nation, the Lakota, also is known as Lakota. Their culture is portrayed in that film, and so Kevin Costner was very defining for him. And he, in addition to that film and everything that connection that he has to the South Dakota and the culture of Lakota, Kevin Costner also took it upon himself to create a museum. He also commissioned this beautiful sculpture, which Hunting the Buffalo. It's outside, installed and portrays how natives used to hunt the buffalo. It's a beautiful sculpture, and in the museum next to it, that dedicated to the story of the bison population, or in the native language, Tatanka is what is known as. And so to highlight and related to violence and different types of violence, the native population depended on hunting bison, right? So there's violence involved, hunting, killing the bison, and using and then every single part of the bison was used to put to good use, whether to make food or clothing or ropes and jewelry, toys, and so on. So they didn't let anything go to waste, and the bison played almost a sacred role, a very important role, and had a significance of sacred significance to the native culture, because they were integrated into the environment. They didn't see themselves as separate from it, and as destined to dominate it. They saw themselves as part of it and living in harmony and balance with the nature. And then the European colonizers arrived, and in a short amount of time, the population of bison, which used to number millions in the prairies of North America, it was, especially during the 19th century, it was reduced to mere thousands, if you can imagine that, because the greed led the poachers and hunters to just kill them, to massacre bison in inordinate amounts, just to profit off of it, for sport, for profit, for various reasons, but not because they're survival, but just for completely other and unnatural in some way reasons. So thankfully, the efforts to revive the population of bison managed to rescue the situation, and today there is a much healthier population of several 100,000 roaming the prairies, both on the protected lands and in the wild. But still, this story is just a stark illustration, a demonstration of how the difference between violence as part of nature, which is kind of the dependence of the native population on hunting and killing bison for their own very survival, and unnatural or runaway violence that motivated by some other drive to dominate over nature. Very different phenomena. And so this violence with regard to bison is not that much different from other types of violence that humans perpetrate against other humans as well. So the Civil War, slavery, the native genocide in the context of the North America are all just different forms of this destructive drive that overflows all natural boundaries and just that is enabled by culture and technology. So these are some of the overarching considerations that underpin much of what we will be discussing today. So with that in mind, let's begin to examine how the phenomenon of violence was approached throughout history by different thinkers. Let me also make a usual disclaimer that this is just an overview, and each particular thinker's perspective that I will be mentioning could warrant an entire separate in-depth episode, and there's a lot there to explore, and I will include some links at least if you want, and you can explore further, and maybe in the future I will record more about some of these thinkers as time goes. But it is also important to remember that any individual thinker's perspective is bound to be partial and incomplete. So, but certain valuable insights can be gleaned from each of the perspectives that I will be talking about. And obviously, as always, my inclusion of any particular perspective does not automatically signal my agreement with it, but it does mean that these perspectives have something to contribute and to our understanding of how history of ideas developed and how different people today even think about these matters, because some of these perspectives are very enduring and influential, and have been very enduring and influential. So, and it will all become maybe a lot clearer, I hope, once we start discussing the philosophies of war next episode, from a more contemporary vantage point, and with referring to recent and current events. So we'll it should become clearer. So let's begin. First group of perspectives is ontological and metaphysical theories of violence. So this is ontology, meaning being. So it's violence seen as something that's kind of ingrained in the very being or reality of our reality that we live in, of the world, or metaphysical, or something it's not just accidental or conventional, but it's deeper built into the structure of the very world we live in. So that's what these perspectives, that's where I want to start. So first is Heraclitus. I referred to him previously when I was discussing dialectics and subject and object dualism in the series about epistemology. He sometimes by some thinkers and scholars, he's considered the originator of dialectics in some ways, especially in an ontological way. So his famous quote is, "War is the father of all things, king of all." And what is meant by that is that conflict, so he used the word polemos, that's a Greek word which can be translated as war or strife. Conflict is seen as a cosmic principle. So it's not just about some human conflict on a human level, or just a garden variety conflict. It's seen as a cosmic principle driving transformation, change. He's famously, Heraclitus also famously saw the world as constantly changing. Another famous quote of his is, "Nothing is permanent except change." So the world was in a constant process of becoming, and so there's fundamental impermanence to everything in the world, and so this strife generates differentiation and order. The opposites, different sets of opposites interact and struggle against one another to create something new, or to create order, to emergent order. So it's like a tension in a bow or a lyre, to use a reference to ancient Greek instruments of hunting and music. So it produces harmony out of this strife. That's the perspective. So so it's not a derivation, it's not a deviation from nature to Heraclitus, but the very motor of reality's flux. So it's ontological. It's part of the reality. Creation and destruction, life and death. These are inseparable opposites that are bound together through this conflict, seen as cosmic reality. So that's one of the foundational perspectives in terms of Western culture, civilization. Certainly it is, and it was picked up again much later in modern times by German idealist philosopher Hegel, all very influential philosopher, for good or for bad. Opinions vary, very controversial in many ways. But he kind of built on Heraclitus. He considered Heraclitus. He was the one really who considered Heraclitus as the founder of dialectics, and he developed his own interpretation of dialectical method, much different from that of Heraclitus. But he referred to him. So violence is Hegel considered violence to be embedded in the negation that propels historical progress, not just process but progress forward. So he saw history. He came up with this philosophy of history, dialectical, where the spirit or the absolute, German word is Geist for spirit, or the absolute is the absolute. He saw that as dialectical unfolding of this spirit, absolute spirit, through history, and so there's destination in a way towards building towards this constant contradiction and overcoming and struggle and dialectics of. I'm simplifying. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. But one aspect of it, he theorized as master and slave dialectic in history, which involves domination and existential violence. That constitutes self-consciousness. So meaning that somebody wants one part of, let's say, population wants to dominate, and the other part that is dominated over then resists, and so this violence is this cycle of violence and the struggle gives birth to self-consciousness, freedom, more rational order, political orders, and that's kind of the perspective of Hegel. And in his famous work Phenomenology of Spirit, he wrote about this master-slave dialectic, this struggle for recognition. There is a risk of life, exercise of violence, but it generates this emerges out of it emerges freedom, greater freedom, higher stages of rational freedom. That's the way he saw it anyway. So wars, revolution, historical ruptures, he thought of it as all generating better outcomes in the end, greater freedom. That point of view has been discredited in many ways since then because of the historical events of the 20th century, to be more concrete. But obviously it's hard to maintain that point of view today. But that was his perspective, and so it was not seen again. It was seen as historically conditioned. Violence was seen as historically conditioned, not an aberration, but a force that drives history forward, destructive but also productive in the same movement, so to speak. So that was and was very influential, and for the reasons I will address in a minute. And the third perspective here that I want to mention right now is Georges Bataille, as a French thinker. He saw violence as a kind of sacred excess, so excessive force, overflowing force that disrupts utility and order. And he linked it to death, eroticism, and sacrifice in various ways. So he wrote works like The Accursed Share and Erotism. He interprets sacrifice, death, and eroticism as forms of violent expenditure that rupture the profane world of productivity and rational calculation. That's his perspective. So violence in this sense, as he viewed it, it's echoing a previous perspectives I just discussed, is a cosmic and pre-rational force. It links to transgression, sacrifice, ecstasy, and reveals the sacred dimension through destruction and excess. So the energy, it's this energy that civilization tries to repress. as he wrote in his Theory of Religion. So rather than serving instrumental ends, he saw violence as disclosing this humanity's relation to death and the infinite, something that is infinite, and dimension of life existence, and placing it at the heart of religious and metaphysical experience. So a lot to unpack here, but I can't go into the depth. But that's another perspective to be aware of. Second group of perspectives. This is critical theory and that emerged in the 20th century, but it started after Hegel. He influenced, as is well known, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Their perspective, they basically took Hegel's system of philosophy of history and inverted it. So he talked about idealist absolute spirit working through history, and they turned it around, and they focused on the material conditions, and they put material, famously known as historical materialism or dialectical materialism, that system focusing on the material contradictions within a society, different classes struggling against each other. So there's exploitation, enclosure, coercive mechanisms of the state, but they did keep this view of violence as Marx called it the midwife of history. So they saw it as historically conditioned and as driving history forward. So that idea was kept, and they just changed the focus from the spiritual, idealistic point of view to materialist, and that there's an interplay of domination and liberation. So that the instrument, violence is an instrument used by the ruling classes to maintain dominance, and at the same time it's also used by the oppressed to gain liberation from this domination. And so they examined institutional forms of violence, and then revolutionary change as a possible resistance, a counteraction. As will, that's famously there. Unfortunately, they made many. Again, this is why Hegel is a controversial, and Marx is as his kind of following from him, and abusing, and in some ways you could say abusing or misunderstanding or misinterpreting his ideas, and starting along the development of ideas that led to the communism and Soviet Union and Soviet China and not Soviet, I'm sorry, communist China and other phenomena like this. So these are directly relevant to our today's life as well. So they saw, first of all, the oppression that was inherent in history, but also the possibility of emancipation and liberation when the old order is broken up and new social relations may emerge. But obviously, the revolutionary upheaval brings a lot of violence and uncertainty and side effects, as we know from the history of French Revolution, from the Bolshevik Revolution in the Russian Empire, and so on, and other examples. Another perspective in this category of critical theory is Walter Benjamin, another thinker in that. He, in his work Critique of Violence from 1921, he distinguished between mythic violence and divine violence. And what he meant by mythic violence was kind of law-making and law-preserving type of violence, meaning that violence that institutes and preserves law and order, binding human life to cycles of guilt, fate, and repetition. Again, a lot to unpack, but I just can't go into details. In both myth and Benjamin's theory, and we'll talk about mythology a little bit in a few minutes, a little bit more about other perspectives in this, along this line. Violence, so in Benjamin's theory, violence is tied to legality and necessity. So to the founding and preservation of structures of authority. And this echoes something I mentioned in the introduction to political philosophy, Hobbes's theory of be pre-state of nature being war of all against all, violence, disorder, chaos, and absolute sovereign is needed to establish order, and monopoly of violence, and so the state is that's how he justified the absolute monarchy, the system of absolute monarchy. So there's echoes here, as you can tell, but obviously Benjamin's theory was different. He didn't justify absolutism or monarchy. So that was mythic violence, but divine violence for Benjamin was something that breaks this cycle of legitimizing order and law. It is not instrumental. Divine violence is not law preserving, but actually a rupture, pure rupture. It's an interruption that destroys law's authority. It doesn't establish a new order of domination. It's and in mythology, these may be seen as moments when violence does not reinforce but shatters the order, the existing order. It just a kind of apocalyptic destruction, divine wrath, ecstatic sacrifice that releases beings, so humans, from the cycle of guilt and necessity. This is one way of looking at it and thinking of it. So next perspective, again, there's a lot to think about, but I will have to move on. So the Frankfurt School is also a continuation as critical theory developed in the 20th century. Thinkers like Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse. Some of them immigrated because of the Nazis. They immigrated to the United States and taught and wrote here. And so they saw violence as embedded in the modern rationality. So it's not something like a deviation. It's actually logically embedded in the system of modern rationality, domination of nature, and instrumental reason. And this is connecting to the story of the Bison here now. So thinkers like which I mentioned, Adorno and Horkheimer, they wrote a book called Dialectic of Enlightenment, among others, where they examine how Enlightenment's drive to master nature, scientific revolution and all that, developments that followed through from that, led to domination of both the natural world and of human beings. So within culture and domination over nature and within culture. Violence becomes systemic, hidden in rationalized forms of exploitation, bureaucracy, and technology. So in this perspective, fascism and totalitarianism that emerged in the 20th century was not a deviation or a regression. It was actually a extreme expression of modern rationality, of the Enlightenment type of thinking, of where you dominate, humanity is destined to dominate nature. And myth and rational control fuse in fascism and totalitarianism to produce new forms of organized violence. And in many ways, both communism, authoritarian communism in the Soviet or Chinese, and other similar expressions, and Nazism and fascism are both flow out of this Enlightenment way of thinking of where human must dominate the nature and society, so and culture. So for them, later also they also criticized the consumer society, that looking at advanced industrial capitalism and how this violence is perpetuated in subtle forms of repression, one-dimensional thinking, manipulation, surveillance, rather than any overt coercion or physical violence. So it's not about just physical destruction. Violence is also about silencing, dominating, reducing human potential to some instrumental logic, constraining human potential to certain acceptable forms of expression, and that's also part of violence. That's second category. Third category of perspectives is kind of flows and echoes of, it's more within the field of political theology and thinking about sovereignty. So three thinkers I want to mention. One is Carl Schmitt, and he's known. He was a German thinker in early 20th century, and he was famously he was legal theorist and political thinker, and he said the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. So his idea of state of exception, so when the law is suspended, for example. So that's what sovereign power is all about. And famously, infamously rather, Hitler used that theory to usurp power after being elected, and the rest is history. We know what happened. But this idea of this state of exception, it's still alive and well, and dictators are looking to use it, justify when they have to legitimize their power grabs. They often refer to this in some manner or other. In this perspective, violence underlies the political, since the capacity to suspend law grounds authority. So it's kind of legitimizing violence by argument in a way. So that's Giorgio Agamben is a next thinker. He's Italian, and he actually took this idea from Carl Schmitt and developed it, obviously not to justify, but to just to develop and to think it through in greater detail. And so in his work Homo Sacer, which it's his kind of magnum opus, one could say. It's a multi-volume project he published. Violence is not just a matter of political repression, but a foundational structure of sovereignty, which is again the same idea. And a human subject, he kind of thinks about, is reduced to bare life. His term is Zoe. It kind of echoes the Greek term Zoe, one of the Greek terms. And so bare life and exposed to violence is a condition of being included in political life. And here also some echoes to the social contract theories within political philosophy, that in state of nature there's certain chaos or lack of rules, or lack of there's violence, and so you people come together to create this society and establish government to protect themselves and to establish law. So that's kind of idealized version. Hobbes, John Locke, were some Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The third thinker in this category is Hannah Arendt, also a fairly well-known philosopher and journalist and a publicist. Essayist, I meant to say. And so she distinguished power and violence in her thinking. She wrote a book called On Violence in 1970. And for her, violence is instrumental and ultimately a sign of weakness compared to genuine power, which is based in collective action and legitimacy. So this is a very important distinction. And the power of this reminds me of this saying or slogan. The power of the people is greater than the people in power. And this is what ultimately I see this perspective as, is that the real power, especially in democracy, when you're talking about the people being the source of power, and the government must serve the people in democratic theory. So this is what that perspective justifies. And she's a excellent thinker to explore and read. She also wrote a very famous study of totalitarianism called The Origins of Totalitarianism, which has been criticized since it's being published, but obviously scholarship moved on since then, but it's still a classic and still an important text. Fourth category of perspectives is now you may start hearing echoes of what I already discussed, but it's existential and phenomenological approaches. So two thinkers here are what to discuss is Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. Heidegger, as famously known or infamously, once again, he supported the Nazi regime in one part in his life, which was a shock to many of his students who didn't expect him to do so. And afterwards, after the war, he still continued. He's still an influential and important philosopher in the history of philosophy, but that moment is very instructive and an example of how abstract thinking can mislead people to make terrible choices. So he didn't actually address violence directly in his writings in philosophy, but he wrote about confrontation with more in the existential key, so confrontation with death, finitude, meaning that our life is not infinite, it ends at some point, and anxiety that based on that fact, and he it can be interpreted as existential violence of sorts that he wrote about, that is at the heart of human being, which he called Dasein. That's his term, that's his philosophical term to refer to a human being. So violence as seen as disclosure of truth and as world formation. So which means that this act of violence, violent rupture, is necessary to disclose something that is true. It helps reveal truth. It's kind of this disruptive force through which beings and worlds come into presence. That's his way of thinking about it. He used the word Gewalt, a German word, that's can be translated as violence. And so in his magnum opus, In Being and Time, he said the human existence or human being, Dasein, is a famous term, thrown. When we are born, we are thrown into existence violently, in a way, and have to face our own finitude. Meaning, at some point you have to face the fact that you will die. There's no escaping it, and so there's existential dread or anxiety that can arise because of that consideration, because of that thought, and people often try to escape it by instead of facing it, they try to escape it in different ways, by religion, adopting different philosophies that justify or kind of obscure the fact that you can't really change that ultimate fact of our existence. Life also implies death, and so these dimensions he described as inherently violent and destabilizing force in our lives. And so he wrote about, again, it's existentialism and phenomenology. That's a perspective of examining individual life and the details of how an individual goes through life and how it copes with what challenges that life brings. Later on in his philosophy, in his career, he also wrote about modern technological, what he called inframing, or Gestell in German. So it's a meaning that technology kind of, he viewed it as this extreme form of violence, that it takes human life and reduces it to humans to resources. Like even the term human resources itself is a reflection of that idea. So resources, the Bestand, that's a German term, meaning that humans are not seen as living beings with their own existence, existential truth, and be kind of potential and multifaceted being, but just as mere resources to be used for some instrumental purpose and controlled in certain way. So this is not incidental in his view. It's rooted in Western metaphysical tradition. That's his perspective. Very influential in many ways as well. So again, this is echoing the first category of ontological violence, ontological perspective on violence. He also explored ancient Greek, early Greek thinkers, Heraclitus and others. So he was aware of all of these, and he it certainly played some part in his philosophy. I'm sure. Again, there's much more that could be said about this, but I will have to leave it at that. Next is Jean-Paul Sartre. In his major work is Being and Nothingness, which he published in 1943. So he looked at violence and human relations as inherently conflictual. Interpersonal relations often result in objectification and struggle, where you look at other people and each consciousness, each of us experiences the other person as a threat to our own freedom on some level. And so this struggle for recognition and for establishing your own freedom space, your own freedom, takes the form of objectification, domination, and can erupt into violence. So from even that level of interpersonal relations from day-to-day life. And then later in the 1960s, he published another work, Critique of Dialectical Reason. And he extended this analysis and this perspective to history and politics. And he, echoing some of the critical theory and Marxist perspectives in some ways, he said the violence is embedded in material condition and class struggle in history. And the oppressed often have no choice but to resort to violence to break the structures of domination. And this may remind you, if you've been following me, if it's not the first episode, I talked about Frantz Fanon in last time about his perspective about revolutionary violence and how he thought that imperialism colonization was done violently, and so to break the hold of colonial history, violence is kind of inevitable in his view. And Sartre wrote the preface to his work, The Wretched of the Earth, famous work. So he underscored this position again: colonial violence engenders counter-violence, and only through this kind of praxis can the colonized reassert their humanity and their freedom and autonomy. So it's for Sartre, just as for Heidegger, violence is an existential condition, but he just focuses on interpersonal relations more specifically, and then takes it also to a historical level in terms of systemic oppression. And then fifth category. And this is when I said when I discussed Walter Benjamin in critical theory, he talked about mythic violence. So this category is focused on anthropology, mythology, and psychoanalysis, kind of an overall category. First two perspectives are anthropological, which emerged out across cultures. Study of myths and ritual and anthropological knowledge that we've gained, we found out that across cultures, myths of creation often involve chaos, acts of dismemberment, sacrifice, or combat that generate both cosmos, which kind of equivalent to order, and culture. So, for example, the Babylonian, one of the earliest cultures that we know of, Babylonian god Marduk slays the chaos dragon Tiamat and fashions the cosmos from her body. In Norse mythology, also Ymir is killed, and his body becomes the material for creation of the world. And these are just two examples. So, there's plenty, multiple examples I could use, but just to use also Greek mythology in terms of Western, one of the dominant Western perspectives. You can take the text Hesiod, Theogony, meaning the creation of gods. There are instances of dismemberment of the old gods, out of which new gods are created. So this mythology is very common in many cultures. So two thinkers is Claude Levi-Strauss. He's a French structural anthropology. He developed structural anthropology and showed how myths encode this symbolic violence, killing, sacrifice, taboo, as ways to mediate opposites like nature versus culture, life versus death, and so on. Mircea Eliade is another thinker who studied myth and ritual, emphasized this ritual kind of violence, sacrifice, scapegoating, initiation as a reenactment of primordial events, renewing cosmic order. So these are it's kind of going back to the initial perspective of Heraclitus that I referred to. This is just studying multiple cultures, multiple civilizations, and seeing commonalities and across these different mythologies and cultures and civilizations. In psychoanalysis, so this is more like a cultural symbolic aspect of it. More clinical psychological aspect of the same consideration is psychoanalysis and depth psychology. And two people I'd like to mention is Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Sigmund Freud, he wrote Civilization and its Discontents in early 20th century. He posits innate death drive, famously Thanatos, taken from Greek mythology, alongside Eros, life drive. That his theories have been criticized up and down many times by many thinkers, and so it's in many ways simplistic or over-determined or distortive, but it's still influential, and it has been influential, and we do discuss it in these terms very often. And they do provide certain insight. So civilization is built by repressing our violent instincts. And you see echoes for Hobbes, for example, or there's state of nature is violent and chaotic, and then the social orders is something to address that question. So this is the same idea, but focusing on the clinical and psychological level, and creating. So this repression creates both order, but also neurosis within culture. Carl Jung, similar idea about these violent instincts, fears, and social unacceptable impulses, which get repressed in our psyche. But he called it shadow, and he didn't really oppose it as a death instinct as much as Freud did. He actually focused more. He also studied mythology a lot, different systems of belief, in developing his theories and practice of psychoanalysis and depth psychology. And he came up with a concept of individuation, where it requires integration of the shadow of those instincts, violent instincts, fears, and unacceptable impulses. To complete the process of individuation, you have to face those instincts and not repress them, and face them, bring them out into the open, and integrate them, accept them, and to be in charge of them, to control them. Otherwise, they can erupt destructively in projection, collective violence, and this is related to collective violence, war, revolutions, and ruptures. So he also famous for his theory of archetypes, archetypal figures. So warrior, trickster, devouring mother, and some others. They express violent energies from the collective unconscious, another concept developed by Jung. So it's not only pathological, but also symbolic, but potentially a way to transform things, a gateway to transformation, personal and cultural, if it's not acknowledged and integrated rather than repressed and allowed to explode. So another thinker relevant, it's kind of transcending, or maybe not transcending, but combining in some ways both the cultural, symbolic, mythological, and anthropological side and the clinical, psychological side is René Girard. And he came up with this mimetic theory. So he was also concerned with the repression, with desire, with violence and order, but thinking about it, but he viewed it as in terms of mimetic desire, meaning that human desire what others desire. You mimetic meaning imitation or copying. It's connected to the arts as well, this notion of mimesis, and at some point I will record an episode on that because it's a very important concept. It leads to rivalry, envy, escalating conflict. So this desire what others desire, right? So what your neighbor has something, you want something the same that your neighbor has. So this inevitably generates violence within communities. That's and so to contain this kind of violence, societies develop this mechanism of scapegoating. Collective aggression is displaced onto certain chosen victims whose sacrifice restores order. So the violence is channeled towards scapegoat in some way, and this sacrificial violence is kind of rooted at the root of myth, ritual, and the sacred. So you see the connection between the clinical, psychological side and the mythological, anthropological side. So religion and culture, in Girard's view, originate as systems for managing this contagion of mimetic violence through ritualized sacrifice. That's his perspective. And he viewed Christianity specifically as special because the crucifixion, this story reveals and unmasks this scapegoat mechanism very openly, and offers an example of quote-unquote divine violence as a way beyond the endless cycle of this sacrificial ritualized violence. So it's one way of interpreting culture and religion, but it's important to be aware of it, whether you agree or disagree. So, violence for Girard is not so just social disruption, but also very foundation of culture. And it's destructive, but also ordering and transcended when it's revealed. So it transcends the violence itself. So I will have to move on, although there's a lot to be unpacked here, obviously, as with everything I've been discussing. Now, six group of perspectives. So we've been discussing mostly Western theoretical perspectives and approaches and thinking about violence, although in anthropology the cross-cultural element and psychoanalysis as well, cross-cultural element appeared, but I want to emphasize some of the non-Western perspectives, like within, for example, Hindu cosmology. Shiva is Kali. These are deities within their system of belief. A cycle of destruction, creation. So Shiva is a destroyer god in some ways, although that's not exclusively that's why the cycle of destruction and creation. It's not one-sided. It's a more complicated view. So violence is not necessarily evil in that point of view. Its destruction is part of the renewal, cosmologically, so to speak. The goddess Kali is a kind of goddess of destruction and violence, and embodies this sacred type of violence. So it echoes Walter Benjamin's perspective. And again, this is an ancient point of view. Hindu cosmology is ancient, so it influenced thinkers in the Western civilization as well. So Taoism is another perspective. Taoism name comes from Tao, which is the kind of nature's flow, if effortless, kind of the harmonious nature, which may involve destruction, but it's not violent in intent. It's part of the balance, of natural balance, as Tao, the concept of yin yang comes from Taoism. So the balance of the opposites. And so Zhuangzi, one of the thinkers in this tradition, criticizes critiques human imposed order and shows how violence can actually result from going against nature, not from nature itself, but actually because humans go against nature, and that's violence becomes destruction, gets produced in the process because there's no harmony, no balance. The balance is disrupted. So to restore balance, violence is necessary or becomes necessary. Again, this is not to justify. It's just interesting insight that Taoism is actually very the whole perspective focuses on living in harmony with nature and balancing things, and ecological way of thinking in many ways. So so it's not justification of violence, it's just a way of thinking about it. Seventh set of perspectives should be very familiar. The evolutionary perspectives on the violence in nature. So relevant is obviously Darwin as a dominant thinker on evolution and his theory of natural selection. He's seen as kind of struggle for survival. Violence is part of that, is viewed as kind of a mechanism of natural selection in a way. Predator, prey, who survives, genes get transferred. So that's the general gist of that perspective. Critics point out that important criticism is that cooperation is also part of evolutionary process. So, and especially in humanity, and not just human, but speaking about humanity, its cooperation has always been important for evolutionary success. So, like mutual aid, and this was one perspective I might mention is Kropotkin's mutual aid, kind of anarchist and mutual aid related from that field of political theorizing. But again, this is more could be said, but I have to move on. So as I said, it's not just in the humanity that cooperation plays a role in evolution, but ethology, which is a scientific study of animal behavior in their natural conditions. Ethology also shows, the scientific study shows that this cooperation and violence all play a role. Some of the thinkers or scholars or scientists in this, Konrad Lorenz, he wrote a work called On Aggression, and he suggested that aggression is just an innate drive in animals, including also humans. Jane Goodall, very famous for her work with chimpanzees and studying their social interactions and behavior, including violence, which complicates the idea that everything natural is automatically innocent. Which, I mean, it's relatively well known at this point that violence is part of nature. So this is just more scientific data that we've gained through different disciplines. And last perspective I want to discuss is post-structuralist views on power, violence, and schizoanalysis is also one of the perspectives, as opposed to psychoanalysis. So first is I want to mention Michel Foucault, his concept of disciplinary power and his concept of biopolitics. So he his approach to thinking about this is that violence is not just about kind of explicit or overt repression, but it operates through diffuse systems of discipline, surveillance, and normalization, imposing norms within society. So his famous work is Discipline and Punish, about the carceral systems, the prisons, penitentiaries, and the philosophies that legal and moral philosophies that went into creation of these practices, punitive practices. He shows how punishment shifts from spectacular violence. So let's say in old times, the king would order beheading or execution or torture. that was just very graphic, open to viewing, and would instill fear in people. That was its function. So spectacular kind of violence. Eventually, it was changed to regulation of bodies and conduct. So like schools, institutional violence, like schools, prisons, hospitals, for insane asylums, and all of them have certain commonalities in the way they try to control human behavior, or kind of steer behavior in certain accepted or channels that are defined by those who have power. So his notion of biopolitics developed out of this work of his. He analyzed how power takes actually life itself, and the progression of life as human, get born, grows up, and gets old. All stages of life gets regulated and controlled. Power becomes interested in how people live and what choices they make, and try to steer, or the famous contemporary concept is nudge. Although it may be used to good purposes, like try to improve, let's say, health behaviors. But there's certain underhanded aspect to it as well, because you're trying to manipulate people's behavior in a kind of, you think you're doing it for their own good, but who's making the judgment, who's making decision, who has that right to make the decision? Where's the autonomy here? So rather than being external to power, violence is actually inherently woven into the everyday microphysics of power. That's another concept from Michel Foucault. So another perspective, lastly, in this is Deleuze and Guattari, also French post-structuralist thinkers, philosophers. Guattari was a therapist, psychoanalyst. They developed an approach called schizoanalysis, but he was a psychotherapist, and Deleuze was a philosopher primarily. But they cooperated, and they wrote two-volume study on capitalism and schizophrenia. The first called Anti-Oedipus. The second volume is called 1,000 Plateaus. And as the term anti-Oedipus, it's against Freud, Freud's idea of Oedipus complex. It's been criticized by anthropologists as well it actually doesn't exist in many cultures. He only theorized that this is universal, but it's not. It's just very specific for the Victorian culture that he was brought up in, Sigmund Freud. So Deleuze and Guattari look at it, and they criticize it, and they argue that violence is not only about repression. It actually, again, this is idea that it can be productive or generative. They see capitalism and desire as connected, and they kind of function through flows that are simultaneously creative and destructive. And this is something related to, reminds me of economical theorist Schumpeter, Austrian School of Economics, who also wrote about creative destruction in capitalism, that on a level of, let's say, when businesses fail, that's part of when economies gets restructured, the economic process. So that was on a different level. But Deleuze and Guattari looked at more, they combined both clinical level and mythical, anthropological, philosophical. They looked at it in many ways, but they viewed nature as kind of this field of machinic field, not in a mechanical way, but a machine in a way that's something that's composed of parts and different flows. And where desire is seen as breakdown, rupture, which is violence, part of rupture and part of creation. So again, this is just overview, so I can't do justice to this perspective. There is a lot more to it, and they examine psychoanalysis, they criticize psychoanalysis, they examine Marxist perspective, they criticize Marxism, and so on. There's a lot there, but these are some of the important perspectives I wanted to mention. So to summarize, just everything that I've discussed today. Different ways to look into violence. It could be depending on the framework. Just some of the ways you can describe it as repressed. Violence is repressed. That's from Freud. Scapegoated, that's from Girard, for example. Violence is part of politics and sovereignty. Agamben or Carl Schmitt before him. Part of sacred or cosmic nature, so that would be Bataille, Heraclitus, and many cultures, ancient perspectives and mythologies. Then it could be part of desire, psychoanalysis, schizoanalysis, and then may be necessary for renewal, which is a perspective like Hindu cosmology or Taoism, and even Greek Western roots of Western civilization. There's also these ways of looking at it. So again, thank you for being here. Please support Ukraine. Next time we will discuss the philosophies of war per se, which is I've been building up to that in light of everything that we talked about in the last 3 episodes. So I will draw on some of these ideas that I discussed. And I will include information, as I always do, how you can support Ukraine, and if you can support my content, like, subscribe, comment, share. I appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Thank you.